Hey everyone, welcome to X-Fundy Diaries. My name is Ellie, my pronouns are she, her, and today I am doing another Q&A. Thank you so much for all of the interesting and thoughtful questions. There were way more than I was expecting, so unfortunately I won't be able to answer all of them, but I did try to pick the ones that had the most likes and that I get asked the most, as well as some that will hopefully help fill in gaps in my story. I also noticed some questions that I've already answered in my very first Q&A, so I'll put a link to that video down below and you can go listen to my answers there. First question, how did my parents restrict the books I read when I was homeschooled, and did I read voraciously? Well, I always wanted to read voraciously, but the way that the books were restricted made that difficult. Every single book on my bookshelf was approved first by one of my parents. So sometimes they would buy books for me that they wanted me to read, and whenever I wanted a book, even if it was from the Christian bookstore, they would need to look it over first, maybe do a little research to figure out if they would approve it and allow me to read it. Because it had to be the right kind of Christian book, meaning that it agreed with their specific beliefs, their specific convictions, and their worldview. And I wasn't allowed to go anywhere by myself until I was 17. So I couldn't take birthday money from relatives and sneak out of the house and go to the bookstore. But even if I could, I wouldn't have, because the idea of willfully disobeying my parents like that was pretty much unthinkable to me. If I got a book as a gift, my mom would immediately confiscate it and look it over to see if it would be approved for me. One memory that stands out was a Christmas when I think I was around 11 or 12, and my uncle gave me an American Girl book called A Smart Girl's Guide to Boys. And I was extremely excited. I was very interested in boys, and I could not wait to read this book. But even as I was opening it and getting very excited, I had a sinking feeling that my mom would take it away and I would never see it again. And that is what ended up happening. I just remember feeling so incredibly frustrated. It just didn't feel fair, but that's how highly controlled the books were in my household. Sometimes we'd have to go to the library in order to use the internet because we didn't have the internet at home. So if I had to write a paper for the homeschool academy I was going to at the time, sometimes we'd make a trip to the library. And it is truly difficult to put into words what it felt like for me as a homeschool teenager to be in the library. It felt so magical and wonderful to just be surrounded by so many books. Even though I was not free to roam around and just read any of them that I wanted. I would have to stay right with my mom in the library. Sometimes this was because I was watching over younger siblings. That was my job, well, most of the time, but especially when we went out. And as a side note, even as a very young teenager, I would often get asked by strangers if my youngest sibling was my own child. That's how often I was taking care of him. But even when I wasn't actively doing that for whatever reason, I would still have to stay with my mom so that she would make sure that I wouldn't go off and pick up random books without her knowing. Books were knowledge. Books are knowledge. And a big, big part of being homeschooled and my upbringing was restricting the knowledge that I and my siblings were allowed to have. I would also do a lot of people watching at the library as a teenager. I would look at other kids around my age and I would imagine what their lives were like. They probably just came there from school. The library just felt like this glimpse of the kind of life that I wanted. And to this day, I love libraries. I love them so much, and it always gives me this sort of wistful feeling that is a callback to my teenage years. So I did try to read voraciously, but I had to read only what was in the small library of our very fundy worldview. Books were like this forbidden treasure, and I was always wanting more. I just wanted to learn. I've always been extremely curious. The only book that I had unlimited access to from the time I was in preschool is the Bible. A surprise to no one. I was given my first grown-up Bible, not just one of those picture book Bibles, when I was in kindergarten. It was light pink. It had my name engraved on it. And my parents felt that that was a perfectly appropriate book for children of all ages. And I think a lot of fundy parents feel that way, which is wild to me now. There is some wild shit in the Bible. Some very gruesome and, in my opinion, inappropriate things for kids to be reading. But my parents did not share that view. I will say though, as I got older, I was told not to read Song of Solomon. And ironically, they would quote a verse from Song of Solomon to explain why I wasn't allowed to read it. Do not awaken love before its time. And I think the evangelical, fundy interpretation of this verse is usually, don't think about sex or put yourself in any position where you could be thinking about sex until you are in a cis-het monogamous marriage. So the idea was, if I wasn't allowed to read this ancient book of erotic poems, then I wouldn't be thinking about sex. Which is laughable because my brain was giving me sexual thoughts all the time, both in my waking life, all throughout the day, and when I was sleeping. I had a lot of sexual dreams. I think because I spent so much of my daily life trying to repress these sexual thoughts, a lot of it would surface when I had no control over them, when I was sleeping. And I would always find a way to blame myself, thinking that maybe I didn't take my thoughts captive well enough, or I had some kind of unconfessed sin that was leaving me open to these sexual dreams. Moving on to the next question. Did I ever go to church camp as a kid? And if so, did I ever have one of those intense final night of church camp experiences involving rededicating my life? Well, I always wanted to go to church camp growing up, and I would beg my mom, but she always said no. However, I did have many of those emotional rededicating my life experiences, mostly at church services and worship nights. The first one that I ever had, at least as far as I can remember, is when I was about 10. We had a Seventh-day Adventist church across the street, and they were always evangelizing my family. We weren't the right kind of Christian to them. And so they were always trying to get us to come visit, and we did one time. And the whole experience was very overwhelming for me as a 10-year-old because it was an extremely charismatic church service. It was so loud. There were people shouting and crying and running down the aisles and speaking in tongues. And at some point, the pastor did an altar call, and lots of people went up to the front, and so did I. I, for some reason, felt really compelled, really convicted that I needed to go down to the front. And if I remember correctly, I had never done anything like that before. But I think just the emotions of the charismatic style of service had a huge impact on me, and I got very swept up in it. And I went down by myself. My parents stayed in the pew. So looking back, I feel like that was pretty brave of me. But I went up to the front and I got down on my knees. I remember it was very difficult to kneel in a long skirt. We had to wear a long skirt because that's what this church required. And I literally like crunched over on the floor and was like raising my hands like this, and there were just like tears streaming down my face. And I can't remember what I was praying about, but I was just crying and crying. And there were these two other kids who were a bit older than me, also wearing long skirts, who knelt on either side of me, and they each put their hands on my back and they were like praying for me out loud. And again, I can't remember the exact prayers that they were praying, but I think it was along the lines of like, oh yes, Holy Spirit, like help this girl, she wants you, she needs you, I don't know, something like that. But the saddest part to me about this memory is that when we got home after the service, my parents were making fun of me. They were sort of joking to each other like, wow, Ellie really got caught up in the spirit there. And they were kind of teasing me about it. And I remember feeling so ashamed and really confused too, because, I was trying so hard to make my faith my own and to really embrace, my walk with God. And I was like, I thought this is what you wanted. Like, I felt the Holy Spirit. I went up to the front. Like, I, humbled myself before the Lord very publicly, even though it was scary. And you're making fun of me for that. I don't understand. Like, what did I do wrong? My guess, looking back, is that they felt embarrassed by that. I mean, I don't really know what else it could be. But I've talked about before how, like, after a lot of church services on the way home, my parents would kind of talk shit about the sermon or the church's beliefs. They often felt above a lot of other Christians, and this whole idea of like, we have the truth. I guess maybe at the time they weren't that comfortable with such an expressive, charismatic display, although later in my upbringing, like when I was a lot older, they would get a lot more into very charismatic things. And, I have a whole video talking about the charismatic beliefs that they raised me with. So I don't know, even to this day, I'm not really sure why they may have been embarrassed by that and why they made fun of me. But I just remember the feelings that I had when they did that. It's just another example of how I often felt like there was just no measuring up, no matter what I did. They would just always be unhappy with me in some way. And that really sucked, because I was so eager to please. Okay, next question. What was the one thing that felt the best to reclaim power over and let myself do when I began my deconstruction process? This is kind of a tough question for me to answer because my deconstruction process did not feel good or freeing in any way. It just felt terrifying and painful for the most part, especially in the first few years. But I think probably the most empowering thing for me was rejecting the doctrine of hell, which was about 9 months into my deconstruction. Because before that, I spent so much anxious energy thinking about every interaction that I had with another human being. I was thinking, is this person a Christian? Are they the right kind of Christian? Am I representing Christ well, being a good ambassador for my faith in this moment? Is there a way I should be working God into this conversation? Am I always ready to give a reason for the hope that is in me? Is this person going to end up in hell because I'm not brave enough to share the gospel, or because I'm not praying without ceasing for them? It was a very transactional way to interact with others. So rejecting hell helped me to begin learning how to relate to other people more authentically and in a much less dire and stressful way. That being said, the fear of hell never fully went away. And that is actually the next question. Have I had trouble letting go of the fear of hell? Absolutely. And to be honest, I am still afraid of hell to some extent, even though I haven't believed in it in over 7 years. Every once in a while, I will have an extremely anxious or triggering moment where I worry about it. Sometimes when I'm trying to fall asleep or I've woken up in the middle of the night, I will worry that, I'm failing my daughter by not teaching her the sinner's prayer just in case. And to be clear, I do not believe in hell. When I really think about it, it doesn't make sense at all to me, but that is just the intensity of my religious trauma when it comes to hell. Because as young as 2 and 3 years old, I was already worrying about it and thinking about it and being taught about it. I will say that these anxious moments about hell definitely are happening less and less as time goes on, but they still do happen. But according to many of the comments I get, especially on my first video, I was never a true Christian, and the sinner's prayer wouldn't have saved me anyways. So to me, that's a present reminder that hell is just a fear tactic. Also, Lil Nas X pole danced down to hell and defeated Satan. So that makes me feel better too. That is obviously a joke, but it's not an exaggeration to say that that music video has helped heal a little bit of my religious trauma. The next question is, do I find myself judging people based on my old beliefs? Yes, unfortunately, I do. The beliefs that I was indoctrinated into are very ingrained in me. It's like a knee-jerk reaction. And there's a way of thinking about it that really helps me. I wish I could remember who originally said this so I could give the person credit. If anyone knows, please feel free to put it down in the comments. But it's the idea that we are not responsible for our first thought, because we all have unconscious biases and harmful things that we have internalized, even just based on societal messages. But what we are responsible for is what we do with that thought once we are aware of it. So when I find myself judging someone based on an old belief, I'll trace it back to where it came from, usually my upbringing, and then I will replace it with my new outlook. And I just try my best to be gentle with myself and to remember that it is a process. Next question. Do I have any thoughts on how fundamentalist Christianity hurts cisgender men? I do have thoughts on this. First, I would like to read an excellent quote by Bell Hooks about how patriarchy hurts men. She said, "The first act of violence that patriarchy demands of males is not violence toward women. Instead, patriarchy demands of all males that they engage in acts of psychic self-mutilation, that they kill off the emotional parts of themselves." And I think that in Christian fundamentalism, this is spiritualized and called biblical manhood. Basically everything described about biblical manhood by authors like John Eldredge, Emerson Eggerichs, and James Dobson give cisgender men these hyper masculine scripts that they're supposed to live up to. And like Bell Hooks said, they are told that they are not allowed to have emotions, which is a really big part of being a human. So I think that that is very psychologically harmful and dehumanizing. And any cisgender men who do not fit into the parameters of this hypermasculine script, for whatever reason, will either be shamed or forced to change who they are in order to not be ostracized. There's a really great series about this on the Straight White American Jesus podcast by Bradley Onishi. It's called Mild at Heart: Love, Sex, and Masculinity. That title, Mild at Heart, is a play on words from the John Eldredge book, Wild at Heart. So Bradley shares a lot of his own experiences, especially with purity culture, and he also talks about the way that the Christian fundamentalist version of manhood causes harm, both to cisgender men and to everyone else. When it comes to how cisgender men are harmed by Christian fundamentalism, I think it's extremely important to look at it from an intersectional lens. And I actually think intersectionality is really important for all topics. Intersectionality was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, and it's a framework for examining the ways that our various identities intersect and interact with each other to create these layers of inequality and oppression in society. There's a great video of Kimberly Crenshaw explaining this in her own words, so I will put a link to that down below. So Christian fundamentalism is going to harm cisgender men differently based on their various other identities because of the many forms of oppression that are woven into Christian fundamentalism. So for example, cisgender men who are gay or bisexual are going to be harmed by the homophobia and queerphobia of Christian fundamentalism. And cisgender men who are asexual will be seen as inadequate and broken based on the purity culture myth that all men are naturally hypersexual. Of course, any men with lower sex drives than expected will be harmed by this too, but I think that asexual men will be harmed even more severely. Another very important example is regarding race. Cisgender men who are Black and brown will be harmed by the racism and the white supremacy of Christian fundamentalism. And this harm does not just come from white men. Unfortunately, it often comes from white women and other white people with various marginalized identities. And this is another very important part of intersectionality, recognizing that people can be oppressed in some ways and oppressive in others at the same time, based on the various privileges and power that we hold. The next question is, why do I say I'm an agnostic atheist? The reason I use both of those labels is because together they most accurately describe my belief system. As I understand it, atheist means that you do not believe in God or a higher power, and theist means that you do. Agnostic means that you don't claim to know for sure, and Gnostic means that you do claim to know for sure. So you could be an agnostic atheist, or you could be an agnostic theist. You could also be a Gnostic atheist or a Gnostic theist. And I am an agnostic atheist. It's definitely possible that I'm making too big of a deal out of this and that I'm being too precise. I have always been a very literal person, and the meanings of words are very important to me. But if I had to choose one or the other of these labels, I would definitely choose agnostic. Because for me, the way that I approach my spiritual beliefs, or the lack thereof, is an important part of my values. I mentioned in my first Q&A how Rachel Held Evans had a very big impact on my faith deconstruction. And she always talked about holding her beliefs loosely with an open hand, knowing that she could be wrong. And that has always been very inspiring and admirable to me. And I've tried to follow her example even after realizing that I myself do not believe in God. And that kind of leads into the next question, which is, what are my thoughts on other religions? I want to answer this question with the caveat that I am still learning and in the process of figuring out what my thoughts are on this. As you can imagine, the way that I was taught about other religions growing up was atrocious. It was extremely offensive and many times not even close to accurate. So I really want to be a lifelong student about this, and my motivation is learning about other people's experiences and respecting different ways of living and believing. I really love reading books by authors of different religions, especially novels and YA books. And I'm also really inspired by interfaith cooperation and solidarity. For example, I will never forget this picture from a protest of Trump's travel ban and how beautiful and powerful it is. I feel like this picture really encapsulates this interfaith solidarity and cooperation. I also want to remember that I am a guest when I'm learning about these other religions, especially religions that are marginalized and that are important parts of other cultures. I know that Christianity is not the only religion that can do harm and that can have fundamentalism in it, but I've been realizing more and more that it's really not my place to discuss that and to point that out. There is plenty in my own faith tradition that I grew up in to criticize and to critique. So I am going to try to focus on that. I actually got a comment on my first Q&A video that was kind of along these lines, and I've thought about it a lot since then. The commenter said, "One thing I did have to learn when criticizing religion is that there are so many non-Christian/Catholic beliefs, like those of Eastern religions or even some of the pagan ones in Spanish countries, that are totally different. I think sometimes Western atheists/agnostics/skeptics need to be careful they aren't being offensive of other cultures outside of what we experience, especially when said individual is white and the religion that is being criticized is one whose followers are decidedly not." I totally agree with that, and I really appreciate this commenter pointing that out. White Christianity has been a huge part of colonizing the entire world. I don't want to take colonization with me into my mindset as an agnostic atheist. And the creator that I think I learned the most from about this topic is Joe Lumen. Here's one of Joe's excellent tweets about that. "If your faith deconstruction doesn't include decolonizing, then you are just switching the weapon you are using to harm others. But harm will continue to be done at your hands." So I definitely want to be cognizant of my privilege as a white atheist, and I want to try to only criticize within my own context. As I said, there is plenty to critique there, and that is the experience that I can authentically speak to since I grew up in it. The last thing I'll say about this question is that I'd really like to learn more about Judaism specifically. Unfortunately, my upbringing was very anti-Semitic, and I'm only just starting to be fully aware of how Christians have appropriated Jewish scripture. Sometimes I get comments pointing that out, and I really appreciate those. And I kind of feel like right now I've really only scratched the surface on this, and I think this is going to be another process of lifelong learning and unlearning for me. Next question. Did I find it a struggle to change my mindset about queer/trans issues after leaving religion? The answer is yes, and I do want to give a content warning for homophobia and transphobia. I'm going to talk about some of the homophobic and transphobic beliefs that I was raised with and that I had as a young adult. So I'll put the time code on the screen. Please feel free to skip this if you want to. One of the catalysts of my faith deconstruction was the whole love the sinner, hate the sin bullshit. That is what I grew up being taught, and it started to not sit right with me for quite a while, especially because I have a gay family member that my parents and some other fundy relatives excluded and harmed for my entire childhood. So right after turning 23, I started to obsessively research about the original Greek and Hebrew of the Bible and different interpretations of those passages that are used to be homophobic. And I came across what is now called the Q Christian Fellowship, but at the time it was called the Gay Christian Network. I also found quite a few other resources, including the work of Rachel Held Evans, Jeff Chu, Emily Joy, and other both queer and queer affirming Christians. So it took me about 6 months to fully change my mindset about queer issues. Unfortunately, it took a lot longer to change my mindset about trans issues. And I think that this is because of how central gender is to the worldview that I was indoctrinated into. Biblical manhood and biblical womanhood was at the heart of all of it, and it was very, very deeply ingrained in me. So changing my mindset about gender was a very radical change for me, and I think that's why it took a bit longer. About a year into my faith deconstruction, I went back to school online to get my bachelor's degree. And in 2016, I took a gender studies class that completely changed my entire worldview. And looking back, I really feel that it was that class that solidified my eventual exit from Christianity altogether. The Christianity that I was raised with was so fundamentally opposed to what I was learning in that class that it was like the final thread that unraveled the whole thing and left me with essentially nothing to hold my Christian faith together. The class that I took was called Men and Women in Cross-Cultural Perspectives, and it focused heavily on intersectionality. We watched a documentary called Growing Up Trans, and we read a lot of essays and articles about race and gender and the intersection of all of it. And I came away from that class with the understanding that gender is a social construct. And that was the way that I was able to fully reject the transphobia that I was raised with. And ever since, I've been trying to educate myself about trans issues and how I can work towards supporting transgender, non-binary, and gender non-conforming people. And I just have to say how incredibly grateful I am for that gender studies class, because it truly changed everything for me. The next question is, how has my journey with discovering/exploring my sexuality changed, if at all? Do I still find that my old views come in the way of acceptance? I think the biggest way that it has changed so far is that I am becoming more and more comfortable and confident in myself as a bisexual person. And I really have to credit sharing on YouTube as a big part of that, because in my personal day-to-day life, I am not out in quite the same way that I'm able to be online. I have officially come out to pretty much all of my friends and family, but I really only have a small handful of relationships where I feel fully seen as a queer person. So that's with my husband and my siblings, and then a couple of straight friends. And one of these friends in particular was the first one that I came out to, and she has been so incredibly supportive and encouraging of me since the very beginning. It obviously feels so good to be fully seen and fully embraced by a good friend, but I think one of the reasons why this particular friendship is so healing for me in this way is because she's Catholic. Her faith in God is very important to her, but it's also a very personal thing for her. She does not evangelize in any way. I have shared some of my religious trauma with her, and she has never forced her faith on me or pressured me in any way. She accepts me exactly as I am, and she is fully affirming of the LGBTQ plus community. It's really awesome to have such a supportive and encouraging friend who sees me on a regular basis as a bisexual person. But with Bi Erasure, I think a lot of the people in my life either forget that's who I am or they don't take me seriously. At this point, I know without a doubt I am a 100% bisexual person, regardless of the gender of my partner or if I have a partner at all. But I don't think society in general understands that. And I think a lot of people in my life don't understand why that's relevant, since I'm married to a cisgender man and we have a child together, if they even believe me at all. For example, I came out to my mom a few years ago, I think it was 2018 or 2019, and it did not go well. She was not happy. She said some very offensive, biphobic things, and then she never brought it up again. And I've mentioned it a few times since then, just when it's come up in conversation, and she has acted completely surprised and confused. So either she's forgotten or she's pretending to. And obviously, this is to be expected coming from a fundie. But I have non-fundie family members who also have either forgotten or are pretending to. And these are people who are pretty progressive. So I think that really speaks to, at least in my experience, the Bi Erasure. It's something that isn't always visible, and so I think it's often easily forgotten. And that leads me to something that I actually wanted to take this opportunity to correct from an old video. In December of 2020, I posted a video called How I Knew I Was Bisexual. And I've actually recently privated that video because I don't fully agree with it anymore. I may do an updated version at some point, but I didn't want to just make it disappear without at least explaining and addressing it. So in the video, I was explaining the various societal privileges that I hold as a bisexual person, including white privilege and cisgender privilege, and I totally stand by what I said about that. But then I said, I'm also in a straight passing relationship, and I posted an article in the description that explained what that meant according to the author who wrote it. If I were making that video today, I would not link to that article, and I would not use the words straight passing relationship. And that's not because I completely disagree with that concept, but I now think that it's not that simple, and there's a lot of different factors that need to be taken into consideration. There seems to be a heated, ongoing debate within the bisexual, pansexual community about whether or not straight passing privilege exists. It is certainly a very complicated conversation. In the beginning of 2021, there were a couple of videos that really gave me so much to think about and started changing the way that I view this entire conversation. 2 videos by Savvy Writes Books and one by Kat Black. And I will link them all down below. I would really encourage anyone who would like to watch them all together, because I feel like both of these perspectives really complement each other and give a very well-rounded introduction to the topic. There's also a pinned comment on one of Savvy's videos that points out that the term straight passing is actually an appropriation of the term white passing. And the commenter says that racial dynamics should not be compared to sexual dynamics, because they're not the same. And that makes a lot of sense, and I think is a great argument for just not using the term straight passing at all. So I want to start by saying that being a feminine presenting person who is partnered with a masculine presenting person does give me a privilege that I wouldn't have if I was partnered with another feminine presenting person. My husband and I look like what society assumes, and I really want to emphasize the word assumes, cisgender straight people to look like. And since society is homophobic and transphobic, we fit into these societal norms. For example, we can be affectionate with each other in public without having to worry about being stared at, being called slurs, or being attacked in some cases. So there's no doubt in my mind that that is a privilege. However, there are many parts of being bisexual that are not a privilege. Being erased is not a privilege. Having little to no representation in media is not a privilege. Having most of that representation be bad and harmful is not a privilege. I was watching the show Jane the Virgin, and at the time it was my favorite show, and I still really like it, while acknowledging that there are some problematic parts of it. But honestly, I feel like most shows have at least some problematic parts. But I remember this storyline about this guy that the main character Jane was dating for a while, who was bisexual. And looking back on it now, I feel like that portrayal was very biphobic. Jane was having a really hard time accepting his bisexuality, and she was really worried that she wasn't going to be enough for him and that he would eventually cheat on her. And if I remember correctly, they ended up breaking up for another reason, but it didn't really feel like the biphobia was fully addressed or overcome. And that storyline had a big impact on me at the time as a closeted bi person. I'm ashamed to admit that at the time I identified more with her perspective than his because of my own internalized biphobia. And the ironic part is that I was very attracted to most of the female actors on that show, but I just thought it was admiration, which is, of course, more internalized biphobia. So all of that to say, that is why I privated my How I Knew I Was Bisexual video. I no longer feel comfortable using the term straight passing relationship. It's definitely complicated, and I would really love to hear from other bi and pan folks. What do you think? What are your thoughts on this? If you feel comfortable sharing, please put it down in the comments because I'm very interested in hearing your perspectives. This next question I meant to answer in my very first Q&A and I forgot, so I want to answer it now. It was, what are my favorite self-help resources? And I'm not sure if all of these would be considered self-help. Some of them might just be self-care, but I would like to list all of them just in case. So the first one is drinking water. I'm a huge proponent of that, and I drink a lot of water. The second one is masturbating, which I understand is not going to be helpful for everyone. The next one is just moving your body in some way. For me, this is usually walking and hiking, but especially the combination of moving and being out in nature is extremely helpful for me. Journaling is another thing. There's gratitude journaling, just writing down very specific things that you're thankful for can be very helpful. Processing emotions and feelings and thoughts through journaling. Someone had asked if I do meditations. I do like to have some go-to guided meditations on hand for panic attacks. There's one I found on YouTube that I really like and has been very helpful, so I will link that down below. I also struggle with a lot of insomnia, so I like to listen to sleep podcasts or meditations sometimes. Lately, I've been listening to a podcast called The Sleepy Bookshelf. I've been listening to a very chill reading of Pride and Prejudice, and that has been really helping me get to sleep. Another self-help resource I would recommend is the ACEs quiz. The acronym ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. There's a couple different quizzes you can take online, and it's not meant to diagnose anything, but it's just kind of a helpful way to look at your upbringing and your experiences to see how these things may be affecting you. And from there, if you're able to, you could maybe try therapy or some other form of healing. There is a really excellent TED Talk on YouTube about adverse childhood experiences, both what they are and how they affect people. And so I will put a link to that as well. To be honest, I don't really read very many self-help books these days, but I love this podcast about self-help books called By the Book. It's hosted by two friends, Kristen Meinzer and Jolenta Greenberg, and they will take a self-help book, and for 2 weeks, they will live by the book. And then in the podcast, you get to hear little clips of their audio diaries, and then they will give a verdict saying, what did they think about living by this book, and do they recommend it to others? But it's really, really interesting to me to hear all these different self-help books and how oftentimes there's a lot of overlap with the suggestions that they have or the principles that they say. But it's also just a very entertaining and fun podcast to listen to. Next question. How did I get started doing this channel and picking these topics to talk about? Well, I kind of ended up creating the sort of channel that I was looking for. During the first few years of my faith deconstruction, I actually searched for ex-Christian, ex-evangelical, ex-fundy people reading their journals. And I couldn't find any, and to be fair, that is an extremely niche kind of content. I would say the closest thing that I was able to find was Emily Joy's YouTube channel. It wasn't exactly her reading her journals, but it does have a lot of poetry and a few videos sharing her thoughts on purity culture and some other topics. One of her poetry videos is called Thank God I'm a Virgin, and to this day, that is one of my favorite videos on YouTube of all time. But her last video was posted in 2017. And then the pandemic hit, and lots of people were creating things, and I was very inspired by that. And I also remember a lot of talk about what's most important in life, what do you want to do before you die? And I had been thinking for a long time about possibly writing a book about growing up in an abusive Christian fundamentalist household. And I still might someday, but writing a book takes a long time and a lot of energy. And I realized I don't want to hold all of this inside anymore. Growing up, I was so silenced all the time, and I felt like it was time for me to start sharing some of this and speaking it out loud. And YouTube felt like a good way to do that. I have loved YouTube since the moment that we got the internet when I was 17. It gave me so much comfort, and it gave me access to knowledge that I had never had before. It just opened up an entire new world for me. So I felt like it would be really special to create something on this platform that has meant so much to me. And I knew that it was going to be healing for me to finally speak some of these things out loud that I had been holding my whole life. And I was also hopeful that maybe it could help some other people to feel less alone if they had gone through similar things. And now I am honestly a little bit overwhelmed by how many people have watched my videos and subscribed to my channel. I am very grateful. I am very humbled, and I appreciate all of you so much. I know I say it often, but you really help me feel less alone. So as always, thank you. The last question I am very excited for because I get to talk about one of my best friends in the whole world, my dog Nova. The question is, who's your cute pup back there? / what kind of dog is he? My dog's name is Nova. He is a Beagle Labrador mix, also known as a Bigador. We adopted him from a local shelter in 2019. He's about to turn 4 years old in May. He is equal parts couch potato and adventure dog, so we spend lots of time cuddling, but we also go on hikes together. I've gotten a few requests for more dog content, and I used to film in front of my bed, but I've recently moved filming locations. So I don't think he'll be lounging in my videos anytime soon, but maybe I can include some clips of him here or there. The topics on this channel are usually quite heavy, so I think it would be great to add some adorable dog content to help ease the pain. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.